Welcome to Let's Talk Possibility, episode 35, on the 4th of June, 2012. This evening, we're talking about what's possible when we use art as a form of social commentary. My guests this evening are Counselling Psychologist Hazel Kurian and Professor Elfriede Dreyer. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Let's Talk Possibility, the show where we explore ideas, challenge thinking, and inspire action. I'm your host, Monge Zimtati. With me this evening is my co-host, Chris Dykes.
Good evening, everybody.
We are joined by two guests this evening. The first guest I'd like to introduce is Hazel Kurian, a psychologist and someone who she started her own practice, her private practice, after completing a master's degree in psychology in 2008. She offers training and workshops for organizations or smaller interest groups. Say hello, Hazel. Hello. We're also joined by Professor Elfriede Dreyer, who is an Associate Professor in Fine Arts at the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Pretoria. She's also a curator and theorist. She is widely published. She curated major works such as the Reconciliation exhibition. She is the founding and owner-curator of the Fried Contemporary Gallery in Pretoria.
Hi there.
To start off with, we'd like to explore what's possible when we use art as a medium or as a form of social commentary. And where this whole conversation started was in less than a month ago. Two artworks were released in two different newspapers within 7 days. The one artwork was an artwork called The Spear, which depicted President Jacob Zuma with his genitals exposed. The other one was an artwork whose name I didn't even get because of the reaction that it got. It was of the Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. And he was also depicted in the nude with a dog sort of lying at his feet. And on the one hand, in South Africa, there was a lot of debate around the artwork, and there were strikes and there were marches and a lot of things happened. On the other end of the world, in Canada, the Prime Minister's spokesperson replied on Twitter saying, well, we're offended. Everybody knows the Prime Minister is a cat person. Okay, so I think, the first question for me would be, just to start the conversation, what is the role of art in society?
I think art has different purposes, and I think it's also changed over the centuries. We don't need to go there, but I think at the moment, art is really a vehicle to express ideas, to comment on society, and to sort of reflect also thinking at a specific point in time, besides being an artist's own expression of own feelings. And so I think there are various purposes, but before the invention of the camera, which is quite interesting, art had a documentary purpose,
yes,
very much, and that has changed now to far more of a social function.
Okay, and in the case of these two artworks, and I'd like to very much get your view on this as well, Hazel. I think as artworks, the two artworks which were released at around the same time, and they were received differently. Why do you think the two works were received so differently to create the opposite reactions, really?
I think maybe also just to expand on what Elfriede was saying, the purpose of art. And art, I think, is something that really keeps a pulse on what's going on in a society in the different contexts. And the outrage, for example, that the spear generated is not just about a president, a particular president. It's not just about a piece of work. It's not just about an artist.
Yes.
I think it's about what else is happening in this country right now. A lot of it is around class issues. A lot of it is around race issues. All of these things that came up then also when the protests were happening, when threats were being made. And I think years from now, when we look back on it, it's like a little window of what happened at that time.
So in essence, I mean, part of what I'm getting is also that I think, I mean, artworks of the day also depict what's happening in society at that particular time. And there are also underlying issues that bring those artworks to the fore, or that makes artists express themselves in a particular way.
But also how people react to the art.
And raise consciousness also for issues. I think that's very important to me. This, to me, was the strongest element that came to the fore, was actually the power of art. And at the moment, if we look at the agendas and we look at where money is being spent in the country, then art is not very high on the agenda. And it's something that's not catching that much attention. And the furor that it actually created was immense, which shows you what power actually art can hold, and the instigation also that it will provide to certain issues.
I think maybe also just to add to that as well, I mean, sometimes it is about making investment in art a priority in a country or a government. But I think even without that, art will happen. I don't know if you've ever seen visuals of war-torn countries in the Middle East. You can look at architecture that's been riddled with mortar and pistols and the rest of it.
Yes.
And underneath all of it, you can still see, graffiti. Graffiti in itself is a form of art. It keeps, again, a pulse of what's happening in the country. And it's not just, someone doesn't necessarily have to have training as an artist. Sometimes art is an expression that really transcends education, it transcends literacy. I think that's also why art can be even more powerful and more important to a population in a context where information is very limited, or access to information is boundarified and guarded, or where there are literacy issues. I think that's why.
And I mean, one of the things that generally happens in a lot of discussions around arts, and when you go to galleries and you engage in a discussion about it, do we a lot of the time also as a society lose ourselves in the importance of the meaning behind art and the artworks, rather than just viewing art for art's sake?
I think it depends on the background that you personally have, your own identity, where you come from, who you are, what your level of information is also. It's called the semiotic reading of the artwork and reception theory. You will find, and I think that's also where there's a lot of misunderstanding very often, because there are various legacies in operating in art, and various conventions, and certain images would have certain meanings, and it's a kind of a secret code, maybe, if you want, that artists understand, and it's a common language that artists share, and which is not always, it's like good literature. The conceptualization that actually takes place in the artwork is not always shared by the public, and this is where the whole term of high art actually came from, and especially in postmodernism, why there was this endeavor to actually break down the barriers, or the gap between high art and low art, and low art then also has been politicized, because that politicization actually had to do with those who are have-nots, maybe, or
this is that whole idea of exclusivity versus inclusivity.
Inclusivity, yes.
Is there a trend in South Africa for the art to move away from this high art perspective, where more and more people are starting to engage in it for art's sake, and just pure aesthetics or beauty or skill or some other kind of aspect of expression.
That inclusivity actually already started as part of resistance art in 1985, specifically with on exhibitions like, for instance, the Tributaries exhibition. And that was part of a drive by artists in the country to actually try and demolish apartheid or raise awareness for the atrocities that was actually at work during the previous regime. And then so-called low art or craft was incorporated in so-called high art exhibitions. But where we are now in art is it's really on grounds of merit, and we would get it. But there's a lot of African artists, for instance, who specifically use materials that previously would be part of craft, now in a conceptual way, and it's stunning works, beautiful works that work very well and comment on a specifically African identity.
Great. And I think there's also, if we go back to something like the Natural History Museum in the UK, where photographs are used of various flowers or birds or animals, whatever the case may be, which for all intents and purposes are very simplistic to understand the beauty of, but it still engages people in discussion and gets people into a point of mutual happiness, if you can call it that.
And artists would find their inspiration there, most definitely. They find their inspiration everywhere. And they would sometimes bring in other materials or ideas, that actually belong to other domains in order to make this comment about something or raise consciousness for something.
And perhaps even in simple movies. I mean, I remember the movie Yesterday, which was about HIV and AIDS, and how exquisite the scenery was and the music behind the movie as a different ways of expression in art. So just maybe making it more accessible to the average kind of person like me.
And I mean, in this instance again of the spear and the Canadian artwork as well. Doesn't it also make a big difference that, I mean, art, you mentioned that, it also has a lot to do with your level of exposure and your level of education and awareness in the arts, but also this particular artwork created a lot of conversation. And in fact, it's not just in South Africa, but I mean, anywhere in the world, I think less than 5% of the population would actually ever go to a gallery or would actually ever talk about an artwork.
Absolutely.
Or some unfortunate statistic like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's probably much, much less than 5%. And in this case, we spoke about, I mean, other conversations around art started happening, even around such simple things as comics, and cartoons that people see in the newspaper every single day and ignore and rather relegate to just not being newsworthy. But in this case, we talked about it. And what does this do to us as a society to start having these kinds of conversations? Does that not increase our level of awareness and our level of education around the artworks?
There could also just be emotional rallying around some of these issues sometimes, and the media can very often also escalate some of these issues, and I think also they can be politicized also in the end, that they actually become so much more, they become larger than life, and they can become much more than what they intended to be. And I think that we were talking about myth making also.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
informally amongst us. And what's interesting about this notion is that we get the dominant myth makers, and they tell the stories, the major stories. They make the stories, and people believe in those stories. I think the most prominent political myth maybe at the moment is the Rainbow Nation. Not
Absolutely.
so. The fact that we believe in, we try to be patriotic and believe in nationalism and solidarity and all those ideals, and that would be the dominant myth. Yet there are many other unresolved or unattended issues in the country which would disturb this kind of a solidarity. And then what you find is that some of these counter mythmakers or dissenting voices, if you want,
Yes.
these spring up and that become another force.
And I think that's what was also in our conversation, informal conversation before, that whole idea of how, for example, a hegemony can use art to then sell its propaganda. And maybe one of the as you were saying, the biggest propaganda that sometimes we do sell, and maybe even we lie to ourselves about it, is, for example, the nature of the South African state and
Yes.
this idea of the rainbow nation, how we're all getting along so well. But and certainly that is a good ideal to try to live your life towards, but it's not to the extent of then ignoring what the reality is, that there is this divide, for example, that, you know, and again, that, for example, that there is crime in the country.
Yes.
I was chatting before as well about how, I mean, we're talking specifically about the painting, or, you know, how the painting has induced this conversation, but art in other forms as well is powerful, such as music, and the whole Shout campaign, bringing awareness and attention to crime in the country.
Yes.
One of the if we were to go back to somebody like Nadine Gordimer during the apartheid times, and her expression of it through writing,
Absolutely.
And still now.
and still now, absolutely.
I've got some interesting questions on in our chat here. Babalo wants to know if art has a specific role to play in a democracy, and if so, what is that role?
That means that you would consider art to be political, and I think art is always political, but not necessarily party political.
Yes.
And the political nature of art would be to express an opinion, maybe to sway people, to maybe try and bring change about, not necessarily of a political nature. And I think art has actually, if we ignore the mimetic function of art, it's had that function for a very, very long time. And I think in a democracy, definitely, I think it can serve a purpose of reconciliation, for instance. We were talking about the Reconciliation Festival, for instance, that we had at the University of Pretoria, which was really an attempt to celebrate the role that the arts can play in reconciling people.
Just to confirm, you used the word mimetic. What is that? What do you mean by that?
It is a reflection of the perceived world, a direct copy, if you want, or a very close imitation of the direct world.
Okay, as opposed to sort of just somebody doing a still life, but
an abstract expressionist work.
Absolutely.
That's sort of like a gushing of emotion. That would be probably be the strongest contrast.
I think, I mean, one of the things I think has been overlooked in particular around the spear, and in many, I think, other artworks as well, even the Lenin artwork that came out, is what that's particularly interesting for me now is how do we as a society, because art is inspired by something. You know, there's always an inspiration behind why an artwork is published, or behind why an artist works on a certain piece of arts, be it music, be it fine arts. And what is it that we do as a society which inspires these kinds of works? You know, how do we inspire such works as a society? Shouldn't we probably as a society sort of step back and have a long, hard look at ourselves?
And each other, and
Yes, I think art should definitely play that role. And, you know, my personal opinion is really, with regard to the spear, that I think it was actually well meant, not to hurt anyone and not to hurt the dignity, for instance, of the president. I think I really believe that we've moved so far beyond the post-apartheid even. We now at a stage where we almost like, they call it in academic term, post-African, where we've passed the racial issues. It's a pity if these racial things still emerge. We're busy with other kinds of realities, and I don't know, it's just a very personal opinion, but I don't think that people mind whether do they mind whether there's a black government or a white government? I think you want to see social issues resolved, isn't it? You want good schools, you want good hospitals, you want a good society where you can live with safety. And then as long as your government is doing that, so probably I think this Hail the Thief exhibition was maybe an attempt to try and improve our conditions.
Absolutely. It's almost as though the artist himself wasn't responsible for the violence. It was the politicians behind it that incited the violence, and maybe got everybody riled up and used it for the political gain.
I think also, I mean, as a personal opinion as well, I mean, I do think that in this country, the parallels are so close between class and race that it is difficult to really distinguish between the two. And again, I think it is a good ideal to strive towards, and that's ideally what we researchers and social psychologists and politicians ideally aim for, this idea of a non-racialized country. But I don't think that that's necessarily the answer. And I think, again, what this painting, for example, I don't know if it was meant to be a conversation starter about race. It wasn't about a white artist against, you know, an black African, you know, president. But look at the power of what art can do. It starts this conversation, and not just in the country of its origin, you know, the world over is now aware of this amazing painting and the amazing fervor that it sparked. And I think that's also, it shows the power of visual art in this particular domain.
One of the things that have been talked about in relation to just not just around this artwork, just around art in general and around creativity in South Africa and people in the creative space who work within those fields, is that there's a general notion in South Africa that edges more toward censorship, and it's sort of always been there, and this caused us to question our sense of sort of self-expression, or where the boundaries lie in expressing ourselves as South Africans. So the question for me is, what are the, you know, where are the boundaries where expression is censored, and what are the repercussions really when it comes to the arts?
You know, this is why the new developments with regard to the information bill, why that is so worrying. But I heard someone quoting a statistic today that I think we are just over 7 billion people in the world, and that only 1 billion of those people have total freedom of speech. I think 3.2 billion have partial freedom of speech, and the rest no freedom of speech. That's the state of the global world. And I think that with regard to that, it's so important to retain that freedom of speech, and that why there is legislation around that. But it's a very complicated ball, this whole issue of human rights, because I think you can have freedom of speech, but not hurt other people, and
I think the line is
not
very
infringe.
thin.
It's very thin. Not infringe on other people's rights as well.
So when is something, for example, a freedom, your freedom of expression versus defamation? And I think that's something that came in with, for example, the spear, but also in many other contexts of art that's been, spoken out against. And I think and there are different kinds of censorship. There's censorship for protection, for example, age restriction, if something is, gratuitously violent, gratuitously of a sexual nature. Obviously there needs to be an age restriction put in. But then and let's maybe move away from the spear. Let's move on to political cartoons and
Yes.
cartoonists like Zapiro, who
Yes.
is always in trouble. And I think his court case is coming up in October, and perfect timing. I think it's sort of leading up to this, and I think a lot of what comes from this, and a lot of work that's been generated from the spear talk is going to probably impact his trial, as well as cartoons like Madam and Eve. Also, really, is it defamation? Is it humor? Also, comedians, which I guess comedy is an art form in itself. When is it defamatory? When is it the right to speak and express about something about what's going on? And so that's why I think it's a very thin line, and it's a dangerous line, I think, sometimes as well. Sometimes people go out of their way to elicit a particular kind of reaction, knowing full well that they are going to get a lot of heat from it. But also, I'm very loath to agree with what, for example, the ANC with the spear wanted, that there needs to be an outright apology, and that it was about the dignity of what happens, for example, to protest songs that have been sung as well. Some of it is defamatory, some of it is exactly that, a freedom song.
You mentioned just a couple of minutes ago the fervor that this created. And I think the word you used was amazing or something like that. But I would question whether the reaction that we experienced in South Africa is perhaps something that's not amazing, and that we did not allow people to express themselves. And in the reaction, possibly it was a form of censorship in its own right. And I mean, there were so many comparisons to other art that's been released lately. We talked about one when we started the show, and of course there's the dinner painting, which is often referred to. But surely, if we really embrace this, then censorship, whether it's through either a political means or violence, is not acceptable.
Or intimidation.
Or intimidation, for that matter.
People maybe felt intimidated, because actually the whole issue was resolved quite
amicably,
quickly and amicably. And
well, one would question if it was resolved amicably after the violence.
Yes.
And then it became almost capitulation, then amicable agreement.
I read an article earlier today. In fact, it was released in a newspaper that I've got here. I just need to make sure, in the City Press. Surprisingly. So there's an article here where they interview Zake Simda, who's a local author, and whose work was banned in South Africa during the apartheid era, and he now works from the United States. And I mean, he makes a few interesting points, but to what you were saying, Chris, is that the point he makes is that yes, there is still a lot of censorship that's out there, but also these kinds of works, not just in South Africa, but anywhere in the world, test the limits of our democracy. And in this case, it was, they went through the relevant sort of protocol. They went to court and they negotiated with the Goodman Gallery, whereas in any other part of the world, a conservative, non-democratic, very conservative country, it would have been dead, arrested, the gallery would have been shut down, it would have been burnt down.
Absolutely.
Even the fact that the painting itself was defaced is in itself a form of expression, because it's probably criticism or whatever the case is. I'm not sure how we could define that, but it is in itself a form of a reaction, a form of expression that society or the community had of the artwork.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think also with Barend Lagrancy, when he sort of went in after Louis Macbella was there, and after it was actually, Barend first and then Louis, splashing paint onto the painting. I think in both cases there was also this reconciliatory kind of a attempt, to almost undo the perceived damage, maybe, that was done, and to try and pacify, which, as you say, I agree with you, it's almost in that same kind of a spirit. And the sort of, the racism that was actually mentioned in this regard was almost unasked for, because we were talking earlier on also about another artist, Ayanda Mabulu, in Cape Town, who exhibited at World Art in 2010, and he made he painted quite explicit scenes of the political leaders in various poses, exposed genitals also, and there was actually no outcry whatsoever. There was absolutely no reaction, and no response. Yeah, I think there you have it, right in front of you.
And also, again, what's happening? What is the political atmosphere at the time? I mean, when that particular exhibition came out, what was happening in the country? Was there an election around the corner? And I think also, is it about geographical location? Is it that the Joburgers are a lot more, I don't know, politically minded, sensitive, whereas the Cape Townians are more laid back? I mean, I think there are a lot of reasonings that could be discussed, or we could be in dialogue around about why that kind of reaction was there. But I don't think it's I think it would be dangerous to look at it out of context. Let's look at what was happening at the time as well. And yes, is it a race issue? Is it that you're only allowed to depict your own race, when you are trying to comment on, something in society?
It's so interesting, because the point is that nudity is not always about sexuality in a painting. Yeah. It's about, first of all, vulnerability. I think the depiction, for instance, of a penis, like in this case specifically, I mean, if we look at the post-war German depictions of post-Nazi sort of like statements that they were making, it was all about power, and it was about abuse of power. And then often when an artist uses specifically a penis as a symbol, it would sometimes be rape. And I think this is what Zapiru also is being sued for. Also is he
alluded to this,
to the raping of the Lady of Justice. And so rape, and then it could also just simply refer to intimacy of various kinds. And so it is, and this is really one of the, I want to say, maybe the Western European legacies with regard to nudity that we have. That it is actually a metaphor for something else. It stands for something else.
I think you raise some interesting points around nudity, and I think just before we close, why is it that, you pointed us earlier to some works by Diane Victor, and there are quite a number of nudes there as well. And historically, there have been a lot of nudes in the arts. And it seems to me as though one of the things that come out a lot is the portrayal of the penis or the male body, and for some or other reason that eliciting some or other negative reaction. Whereas historically, there have always been nudes of women that are seen as just beautiful artworks. What is it about the male figure, and particularly the penis, that makes artworks rather that creates this negative reaction around these artworks? What are the differences between the male and the female figure?
I don't think it's necessarily limited to the female form, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Elfriede. I think there's a long history of the male naked form or nude form being depicted, but maybe it's David being a perfect example.
Yes.
But maybe again, let's look at the context. Is it a cultural issue? The African depiction of a male penis. It's very closely linked to that idea of potency and power. And so what does an exposed penis then show. It shows a vulnerable president, potentially.
I think the negative association would definitely be rape, because, and I think that was what the feminists also complained about. But the feminists also complained about women being shown in the nude,
Yes.
so often, and
Sure.
the gazing and the exploitation and the male gaze and exploitation of women's nudity and all of that. So, yeah, there are these histories behind these images. And
No, because for me, I mean, just what came up for me while we were talking is that a lot of the works that come up and a lot of the discussion points that come up are around the male figure, and nothing came up around, a naked female figure as being a sort of a focal point. And yeah, I mean, one of the last question I'd like to ask is, so what is possible when we use or when we let art thrive as a form of social commentary? What is possible from either a psychological perspective or the perspective of the arts and the growth of the arts?
I think art should continue to play a constructive role in society, and I think it should continue to question. It should have the freedom to question. And I think it's very often a very sort of a peaceful almost way of lodging complaints, maybe, or expressing yourself. There's no violence intended. Maybe violence in terms of the message, maybe, but sometimes it is necessary. It's what the artist maybe feels is necessary, but it's not all art that is so satirical.
Yes.
It's only a couple of artists, and you refer to Diane Victor. I think in her case, maybe what the difference is that in her case, she shows some extremely violent images, especially with regard to HIV/AIDS, but it's not linked to a person. And I think that also has its own message in terms of what art can do and what art should do.
And I guess maybe to add to that, it's not. I don't think it's necessarily about art should have an important role to play in social commentary. Art will have an important role. It will always, and again, it will come out in. Even if art is muzzled, if democracies had to fall and we lived in a society that was, completely oppressive, there are ways, life, I guess, and society
Yes.
and, revolutions will always find a way. And it can be in secret art that is, smuggled across borders. It can be in graffiti. It can be in protest songs that are sung kilometers, thousands of miles away. Around the world, and I guess again that's the beauty of art. There's also, of course, the danger of art, which we covered about how it can be used and has been used in the past to support oppressive propaganda as well, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Nazi Germany, and how people need to be aware of the effects of art, that it can be something that inspires and that it can be nation building. It can also be manipulating.
It can also be fun.
Absolutely, can absolutely be violent. Yes.
On that absolutely fun point, I'd like to thank my guests, Hazel Kurian, a psychologist, for joining us this evening, and Professor Elfriede Dreyer for joining us. You can get a hold of our guests on. For Professor Elfriede Dreyer, she is available at the Fried Contemporary Gallery website at www.friedcontemporary.com. And Hazel, you can get a hold of at oneheadspace.com. Thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Possibility this evening. This was episode 35.
Thank you, everybody. Good night. Good night.
Bye.